Hello and welcome to installment 14 of Black Cat Theology. Let's begin today's lecture by reminding ourselves of where we left off. In the course of the last three lectures, we have been examining some ideas from the later philosophy of Ludwig Wittgenstein that we hope will help us to develop a theology of Gelassenheit, or letting be. This is one of the two theological options that we extracted from Heidegger's later writings. And what we were principally concerned with in these last three lectures was this notion of objectivity without being an object. In other words, we're trying to clarify the idea of something that purports to be real out there, beyond us, without that real something being a particular object or a particular being. And here we found Wittgenstein's notion of grammar to be very useful. Specifically, we applied it to the notion of the holy, and we were saying that what gives us the grammar of the holy, sort of what gives us our purchase on the holy as something that's real and out there but is not any particular object, is the very rich vocabulary of religious gestures with which we are acquainted. These are things like folding your hands in prayer, bowing your head, raising your arms in certain kinds of hieratic worshiping gesture. It might involve singing. It might involve quiet meditation in a monastery or somewhere else. It might involve a group of people in a religious service facing the same way, showing their homage to the Holy Presence in a communal manner. All of these things are part of the grammar of the holy. They are things that we would teach a child if we wanted to convey to her the notion of the holy as a presence to which we are responding through those gestures. We also saw that those gestures are appropriate whether we are encountering the holy as something that is daunting and overawing and a little bit agitating, or we're encountering the holy as something that's intensely fascinating and is something to which we are drawn, something highly desirable with which we wish to be or seek to be united. So those different aspects of the holy are combined or addressed through this common religious grammar, this common grammar of religious gesture. We saw that that was very helpful in overcoming the ontological antinomy we encountered in the views of Rudolf Otto. Now, one thing that we wanted to clarify also, one caveat, is that we are not suggesting that the holy reduces to these religious gestures. There's not a kind of behaviorism about the holy. The gestures purport to be about something beyond us. So the holy doesn't simply consist in the fact that we engage in these various religious gestures. That's not the case. But we need to explain that better. And in particular, we need to say, well, what is it to get the holy right? What is it to respond to this holy presence through these gestures in a way that is proper as opposed to improper? That's one promissory note that we need to make good on in the course of the remaining lectures. Now, more generally, let's step back and also keep in mind the big picture here, which I hinted at it just a little bit. And that is that we're undertaking these considerations in the attempt to develop a theology of Gelassenheit. Remember that there are three pitfalls or potential problems with Gelassenheit theology that we discussed back there in the lecture where we constructed our ledger, comparing the respective strengths and weaknesses of Gelassenheit theology and Streit theology. And there were three weaknesses that we indicated. The first is that if Gelassenheit is this kind of serene letting be in the face of the holy, a kind of peaceful dwelling, if you will, if we are not careful, there is a risk that that can lead to a kind of complacency about the holy, because then the holy is really not being encountered as something that is galvanizing, something that challenges us to live differently perhaps, or to make changes. It simply is kind of a Sunday morning stillness that's very pretty and interesting, but it threatens to become rather boring. And very soon, what becomes boring gets forgotten. And so we've got to be careful about that. One thing that I think is useful here to keep in mind, and it is something that we will need to go into more detail about subsequently, is, though, that within the overall experience of Gelassenheit, something that Otto helped us to see, there are these different components. There's sort of push-pull. On the one hand, there's the fearsomeness, the awesomeness of the holy, but then there's also this desirability, this fascination. And so there's a kind of, not just tranquility, but there's a kind of energy there, an energized tranquility. And so we're going to want to see how those different elements within the overall Gelassenheit experience might interplay in order to make the holy something more than a kind of placid and ultimately boring and dismissive Sunday morning stillness, as I've called it. That was one question, a problem with Gelassenheit theology. Another problem that we saw was that we need to explain very clearly the difference between the two advents that Heidegger describes in his narrative, for example, in Beiträge zur Philosophie. There's the advent of the non-metaphysical event of being, and then there's the possible advent of what Heidegger calls the passing by of the last God. We need to explain more clearly what it is about the encounter of the holy that's different from the encounter or the non-metaphysical event of being. That's something that I want to do not in the next lecture, but hopefully in the one after that, when we turn to some of the things that Heidegger says about National Socialism. But that is something that we're also going to have to keep in mind. And the third potential pitfall for Gelassenheit theology is that so far we don't really see any clear connection between this theological stance or option and the central doctrines of the Christian faith, things like the incarnation, the atonement, the Trinity, and so forth. And so that's also going to be, we're also going to need to explain that connection better. Now, today I want to do two things in this lecture. The main thing I want to do is I want to begin to explore how the holy might enter into human decision making. And this goes back to what I was talking about a minute ago when I said that we need to explain better what it is to follow the holy properly as opposed to improperly. So what is it for us to allow, how might the holy enter into our process of human decision making as something that guides us to follow it, and that we could also, though, make mistakes about. We might refuse to follow it, we might follow it improperly, or we might not follow it at all. So we need to get clear about that. And what is important there is to begin to explicate the different elements that might be part of a kind of Heideggerian decision-making process that is conducted under the aegis of the holy, that is guided by the holy. And the two aspects of it that I want to discuss today are what is the initial, sort of the starting position when we are going to make a decision. From what position do we start in this kind of Heideggerian analysis? What is that? And then I want to look at some aspects of that. In particular, there's a certain kind of temporality that this starting position or opening situation, if you will, has that might be helpful as we analyze and elucidate this possible form of decision-making guided by the holy. So let's begin with the kind of opening gambit or the opening situation. So suppose that we are preparing to consult the holy or to turn to the holy in the hope of making a principled, a prudent decision under its guidance. And Heidegger talks about, in this regard, a kind of reflective attitude, a kind of reflective openness that he associates with thinking. Now, when Heidegger talks about thinking in this regard, he doesn't have in mind scientific thinking or calculative thinking or cost-benefit analysis thinking in economics. He has thinking, a certain kind of thinking that's very different in mind. He has in mind a very different way of thinking about thinking. And the following passage from one of his essays begins to give us an insight into this. Heidegger says, "The Old English thinkan, to think, and thansian, to thank, are closely related. The Old English noun for thought is thank or thonk, a thought, a grateful thought, and the expression of such a thought, Today it serves in the plural thanks. So Heidegger sees an intimate connection between thinking, in this sense that he wants to elucidate, and thanking. Now, immediately a certain objection looms, and that is, if we are interested in trying to implicate or implement this kind of initial situation of being thoughtful into the process of making decisions under the guidance of the holy, doesn't that get things backwards? In other words, we don't start out making a decision by thanking the holy or anybody else. That should come at the end of the decision-making process, when we have actually made a prudent decision, when we have followed the holy properly, or at least tried to, and then that's when thanking would be appropriate, not at the beginning of the process. So it seems like that gets things backwards. However, when we look more carefully at what Heidegger has in mind here, I think we can see that he has a way of overcoming that objection that's fairly straightforward. Here's a passage that's relevant to that consideration. Heidegger writes, "Thus we give thanks for our thinking in a sense that is almost lost to our language, and, so far as I can see, is retained only in our Alemannic usage," that's a German dialect. "When the transaction of a matter is settled or disposed of, we say in Alemannic dialect that it is thanked." Now, here Heidegger has in mind a situation where somebody simply feels thankful or grateful that a difficult impasse or obstacle has been overcome. So we might think of a farmer at the end of a long, hard winter who now sees the springtime coming and is very thankful to have gotten past that winter. Well, I'm really thankful that that's over. I'm thankful that I'm no longer dealing with burst water pipes and, frozen ponds and livestock that's freezing and so forth. I'm very happy that it's now spring and thankful. I'm grateful for that. And the farmer could feel this kind of thankfulness without thanking anyone or anything in particular. He's just thankful. Now, that, I think, is the sense of thinking as thanking that Heidegger has in mind here. It's a kind of just being grateful to be in a situation where a certain obstacle has been overcome or avoided. And this fits quite well with what we have been saying all along about the advent of the non-metaphysical event of being. Remember, in an earlier lecture, we said that it's a better way of thinking about this is not as some kind of monolithic, all at once lightning strike, where we suddenly no longer think about being in metaphysical terms and all the metaphysical scales drop from our eyes, and so we think in this radically non-metaphysical manner. No, it's a piecemeal process or something that unfolds piecemeal on a particular occasion. So, for example, I might be in the grip of a kind of metaphysical conundrum about, let's say, unity in diversity, to use an example we discussed previously, or maybe some other kind of philosophical perplexity. You might think of one yourself. And then I hit upon a kind of insight that shows me that, well, there's certain notions that seem to be fueling that conundrum or that problem, that if I understand them in another way, in a non-metaphysical way, that problem is no longer compelling. I'm no longer in the grip of it, and I might be glad about that. I might be thankful for that. So that I find myself in an open situation, if you will, of relative clarity. Not all for once. That doesn't mean that all philosophical and metaphysical problems are somehow solved or dry up and blow away at one fell swoop, but maybe something that was exercising me or that was gripping me has now, I'm free of that, and I feel very grateful for that and ready then to move forward in clarity. Grateful that the problem is past and ready now to move forward in clarity. That, to me, in general, is how this initial situation that I'm talking about should be described. This initial situation that is sort of the lead-in to making decisions under the guidance of the holy. And I want to call that a situation of thoughtful openness. It's thoughtful in the sense that we have seen our way or come to move past a particular problem or conundrum that was hamstringing us before, and now we are open to move forward from there in a positive way. Now, Heidegger goes on to discuss some aspects of what I am calling thoughtful openness. And there is both a temporal aspect to that and a spatial aspect. In other words, there's a certain kind of temporality that is characteristic of thoughtful openness, and there is also a certain kind of spatiality. Today, I want to focus on the temporality. Next time, I want to come back to the spatiality. And the reason these aspects are important is that they will play into the process of decision-making in crucial ways, as we will see. They will enable us to make these decisions, to do what needs to be done in order to put ourselves in that position and to carry it forward so that we can seek the Holy's guidance in making a decision. So let's start with the temporal aspect. And here Heidegger says something quite interesting. He associates it with memory, but again, memory in a somewhat unusual sense. Memory, initially, did not at all mean the power to recall. The word designates the whole disposition in the sense of a steadfast, intimate concentration upon the things that essentially speak to us in every thoughtful meditation. Aha, thoughtful meditation. That's interesting. Thoughtful openness. Originally, memory means as much as devotion. A constant, concentrated abiding with something, not just with something that has passed, but in the same way with what is present and with what may come. What is past, present, and to come appears in the oneness of its own present being. So this temporality has these three temporal dimensions of past, future, and present coming together in a certain way. And what's important here, it seems to me, is that that temporality is supposed to help us in seeking guidance from the Holy. Now, how does it do that? Heidegger doesn't explicate this, but I have some ideas about how he might. And to develop this, or to make it clearer, I want to look at a couple of things that Heidegger says about time in a poetic context. Before I do that, I want to remind us of what Aristotle says about time. Aristotle basically thinks that time is the measure of change, that time is segmented into these various increments. They might be minutes or hours or days or what have you, and then these increments of duration that we can then use to measure and compare different changes. So let me give you a very simple example. Suppose that we have a true hourglass, and every time it empties, 1 hour has passed by. Here we have an automobile that goes 50 miles during one rotation of the hourglass, so that it goes 50 miles an hour. Here, on the other hand, we have a faster car that goes 75 miles, traverses 75 miles during one turn of the hourglass, so it goes 75 miles per hour. So here we are able to compare the relative changes of each vehicle in terms of this measure, this measurement, this hourglass, and that's time. We have segmented time into units of duration, in this case hours, as measured by a true hourglass, and that enables us to compare those respective changes in terms of faster or slower. Obviously, the second vehicle is faster than the first. So that's crucial to Aristotle's basic conception of time. Now, Heidegger's very critical of Aristotle, sometimes a bit unfairly, I think. I discuss that at more length in the book. But I think that on a deeper level, there's a point of convergence between this Aristotelian notion of time as the measure of change and Heidegger's notion of temporality that is implicit in thoughtful openness. Let me give a couple of examples. Here, Heidegger is talking about or discussing the poetry of Georg Trakl. And there are two poems, or verses from two poems that I want to discuss. The first one is from Trakl's poem To One Who Died Young, and it has to do with the poetic figure of Ellis, who is a child who died prematurely. There's a beautiful verse in which this child is described. It says, "But the other descended the stone steps of the Mönchberg, a blue smile on his face, and strangely ensheathed in his quieter childhood, and died." That's a poetic figure, the figure of Ellis. Another poetic figure that Heidegger discusses from Trakl's poetry is from a poem called Summer's End. Here's a verse that pertains to that. "So quiet has the green summer grown, and through the silvery trees there rings the footfall of the stranger. Would that the blue wild game were to recall his paths, the music of his ghostly years. It's a lovely piece of poetry, even in translation. I'm sure it's even better in the original German. So here we have the poetic figure of the stranger. Now, what I want to suggest is that here, the poetic figure of either Ellis or the stranger can function in a way comparable to an hourglass, or a watch, or a clock, or something like that. Why is that? Because when we thoughtfully encounter these poetic figures, or a particular poetic figure, we may become aware of certain changes that have transpired in our lives and in the lives of other peoples and in the world indeed since the past, over the past, and possible changes that may unfold in the future. So for example, I might go back and reread some of Trakel's poetry about, let's say, the stranger. And I haven't read it in many, many years. But when I reread it, I become aware of certain changes that I have undergone since the last time I read it. Maybe I've become a little too selfish, or maybe I've become a little too absorbed in my everyday work and I'm not taking enough time to spend with my family or my friends or something like that. I might also become aware of possible changes in the future. Well, I might decide to spend more time with those people. I might decide not to work so hard, or maybe I might make the alternative decision to spend more time alone. So that whichever way I go, that would give rise to a particular present in which I make the decision in question. So here we see that those three temporal dimensions are coming together, the past and the future forming a certain present through decision. And this kind of trackle temporality, I want to call it, is very important to that. And something like a piece of poetry, or a poetic figure, or it might be something, those are fictional things, but it might be something real. It might be a friend, it might be a place, it might be a practice, a religious service, or something like that. That might also serve as a focal point, a kind of trackle clock, which I can use to focus my awareness of actual changes that have transpired in my life since the past, since some past moment, possible changes that might transpire in the future, and give rise to a very definite present. So that's what I want to call a trackle clock. Let me give another example, of this time of a place. Suppose that Angelina goes to a summer cabin at the end of every summer before she goes back to school. Maybe she's a professor or something. And so she sort of goes there to unwind, to become focused, to become calm and careful in preparation for the new school year. Suppose that since the last time she visited the cabin, suppose she goes back and she becomes aware of the fact as she's doing her daily routine and spending time hiking and camping and whatever she does during that vacation period. Suppose that she becomes aware of the fact that since the last time she was at the cabin, she is using a lot more electronic devices and gadgets, her iPhones. She's twittering too much. She's got her laptop there. She's much more connected than she used to be. That's a change that has transpired since the past. That's since her previous visits to the summer cabin. That's a change, an actual change that's transpired. And she then may also become aware of possible future changes. She might decide that she doesn't want to spend so much time using these gadgets. Or she might decide, oh, well, there's not really any problem with that. I'm going to continue at my current level of usage. Or she might even decide to increase it. So there are those possible changes of which she becomes aware through the focal point of the trackle clock, which here is the summer cabin and its environs. She becomes aware of those changes so that they get held up for decision. And that's what trackle clocks and trackle temporality do. They make the agent aware, who is in a situation of thoughtful openness, aware of changes that have actually transpired in the past, changes that might transpire in the future to give rise to a particular present, so that these changes now are held up for decision. Now, how does that decision get made? We're not there yet. We have to discuss that later. But now we're closer. We've made some progress in our project of analyzing a possible way of making decisions under the guidance of the holy. So That's what I want to say for today. Next time, we will look at another important aspect of thoughtful openness, in addition to the temporal one, and that is a certain kind of spatiality. I want to discuss that, and then I want to begin to put these elements together in the full account of decision making. One other thing that I would like to say today, and that's a procedural point. I am very happy and appreciative of those of you who are following my lectures. I hope that if you have the opportunity, and if you feel moved to do so, that you might share the link to my YouTube site with other people. I would like to draw some more traffic to the site. I myself have stepped back from social media for various reasons we don't need to get into right now. But I would appreciate, if you feel so inclined, I would appreciate it if you would share the link to this YouTube site with some interested friends of yours or people you know who might be interested in following it, because I think that what we're doing here is very important. And my primary objective, again, is to help people, to give them tools to bring a certain kind of theological clarity in one way, not the only way, to their faith. So thank you again for your attention. Next time we will continue with this project, and I wish you all a good day.